She was 61 years old, and she had buried her husband, her savings, and most of what people call dignity, all inside the same hard Kansas winter. Her name had been spoken with respect once, and now it was spoken mostly as a warning to other women about what happens when a man's debts outlive him. Her brother-in-law, Garrett Voss, who had inherited the family's good name and none of its conscience, had stood in her doorway with the bank's paper in his hand and told her the house was his now, signed over in a clause she had never been shown, and that she ought to be grateful he hadn't pressed the matter sooner. She left with $11.40, a tin of her mother's seed beads, and a quilt that smelled like wood smoke in better days. 3 miles outside a town called Amity Springs, she found a collapsed apiary, 40 hives gone to rot in silence, advertised for almost nothing because the man who'd kept it had vanished without a word 2 winters past. She paid $4 for the whole ruined lot, and the auctioneer laughed at her for it. She told herself it was foolish, a desperate woman's purchase, bees and broken boxes and weeds grown up through the slats. She did not know yet that one hive, the oldest and strangest of them all, had been sealed shut on purpose, and that what waited inside it would not only save her, but would settle a debt the whole town had been quietly owed for 14 years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Odessa Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, or rebuilding from something that broke you clean through, tell us in the comments. We would be glad to know you are still here, still building. Odessa had not always been a woman without a name worth using. She had been born in 1841 in a stone farmhouse outside Lexington, Kentucky, the third daughter of a beekeeper named Thomas Greer, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who spoke to his bees the way other men spoke to horses, low and steady, never raising his voice even when the smoke wouldn't catch or a swarm bolted for the treeline. It was from her father that Odessa learned the strange, patient language of hives, that a colony was not a single creature but 1,000 small decisions made in agreement, that the queen was not a ruler so much as a promise the others kept, that honey was simply what was left over after a community had taken care of itself first. She was 8 years old the first time he let her lift a frame heavy with comb, and he had told her, in the voice he saved for things he meant permanently, that bees never wasted what they built, and neither should a person. She carried that sentence the way other girls carried scripture. Her mother, Ruth, was a quilter and a healer of sorts, the kind of woman neighbors walked 3 miles to see when a fever wouldn't break or a baby wouldn't come easy, and from her Odessa learned that a steady hand and a closed mouth were worth more than any schooling. The Greer farm was modest but it was never hungry, and Odessa grew up believing that the world, on the whole, rewarded careful work. She married young, at 19, a gentle and unambitious man named Walter Calloway who farmed corn and loved her without complication, and together they raised 2 sons who grew up, as sons do, and moved west to Nebraska to chase their own dirt and their own weather, writing letters that grew thinner and further apart with each passing year, the way good intentions often do once distance gets its hand around them. When the war came through Kentucky, it took something from nearly everyone, and it took Walter's older brother, Garrett's father, in a skirmish near Perryville that left Garrett fatherless at 12 and somehow convinced, in the strange arithmetic grief does on a young mind, that the world owed him compensation for it. Walter, being the kind of man who could not watch a child go hungry, even a child who would grow up resentful, took Garrett in, fed him, schooled him alongside his own sons, and eventually, when Walter's health began its slow decline in the 1870s, signed papers naming Garrett as the one to manage the farm's affairs, trusting blood over caution. It was a kindness that would later be turned, slowly and legally, into a weapon. Odessa kept her father's bees the whole while, a small apiary behind the Calloway house that she tended herself, 12 hives that gave her something steady to do with her hands while the world rearranged itself around her, and from them she made honey she sold at the church social and beeswax candles she traded for thread and coffee, small dignified commerce that asked nothing of anyone and answered to no one's permission. Walter used to say that Odessa's bees were the only creatures on the place that never once disappointed him, and she used to laugh and say that was because bees, unlike men, never pretended to be something they weren't. Walter died in the autumn of 1885, quietly in his sleep, the kind of death that leaves a woman almost ashamed of how unremarkable it was after a lifetime of remarkable love, and it was only after the burial that Garrett Voss, now a grown man of 37 with a banker's smile and a stranger's eyes, produced the paper that named him executor of the estate on account of debts Walter had supposedly co-signed for him years before, debts Odessa had never been told about and never seen evidence of beyond Garrett's own ledger, conveniently kept and conveniently unverifiable. The county judge, an old friend of Garrett's father, found the paper sound enough, and within 4 months of laying her husband in the ground, Odessa Calloway found herself standing on the porch of the house she had kept for 30 years, watching strangers carry her furniture out into a wagon, while Garrett stood at the gate not quite meeting her eyes, telling her she ought to be grateful he hadn't pressed the matter sooner. She did not curse him. Her mother had not raised her to curse, and her father had not raised her to waste breath on people who'd already decided not to listen. She took the $11.40 that remained from selling what little jewelry she had left, the tin of seed beads her mother had given her at her wedding, and the quilt Ruth had sewn from scraps of every dress Odessa had worn growing up, and she got on a train heading west with no particular destination, because a woman with nothing has the strange freedom of being able to go anywhere at all. She got off in Amity Springs, Kansas, not because she meant to, but because the conductor announced it was the next stop with a water tower and she had run out of conviction about going further. It was the spring of 1886, and the town was modest. A grain elevator, a mercantile, a Lutheran church with a crooked steeple, and a population of perhaps 400 souls who had the particular weariness of a community that had survived a hard decade of drought, grasshopper plagues, and the slow bleeding out of young people toward bigger cities. She took a room above the mercantile for 50 cents a week, paid by mending shirts for the owner, a kind, tired widower named Hiram Tolliver, and it was Hiram who first mentioned, almost as an aside while she sewed, that there was an old apiary out past Bell Creek Road, abandoned 2 winters back when its keeper, a reclusive German immigrant named Albrecht Vogel, simply disappeared one autumn and was never seen again, leaving 40 hives to the weeds and the weather. Something in Odessa's chest moved at the word apiary, the way an old ache moves when weather changes, and she walked the 3 miles out to see it the very next afternoon. What she found was a sorrowful, beautiful ruin, 40 box hives arranged in 3 long rows beneath a stand of cottonwoods, most of them collapsed or split by frost, swarms long gone or dead, but a handful, perhaps 6 or 7, still humming faintly with life, feral colonies that had simply kept going the way bees do, indifferent to human absence. The land itself, 4 acres with a falling-down cabin and a spring-fed well, was being sold at auction by the county for unpaid taxes, and when Odessa asked Hiram what such a forsaken place might fetch, he laughed gently and told her probably nothing at all, since nobody in Amity Springs wanted bees, they wanted wheat. She attended the auction with her $11.40 in a handkerchief pinned inside her dress, and when the auctioneer, a sun-cracked man named Otis Pruitt, called the lot and got no bids at all, not even a murmur, she raised her hand and offered $4, and the room laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh at something sad dressed up as something else, and the gavel came down, and Odessa Calloway, twice landless now, became the owner of 40 broken hives and a falling down cabin on Bell Creek Road. She moved in that same week, sweeping out mouse nests and patching the roof with tin scraps Hiram gave her on credit, and she began the way she had been taught, by listening before she did anything else. She walked the rows at dawn when the bees were calmest, noting which hives still had life in them, which were beyond saving, which merely needed a steady hand and patience. Most of the boxes were Vogel's own design, simple and sturdy, but one hive at the very end of the 3rd row struck her as wrong the moment she laid eyes on it. Not broken like the others but deliberately sealed, its lid nailed down with iron tacks driven so firmly that rust had bled down the wood in long orange streaks, and a strip of waxed canvas wrapped around the seam like a bandage, as though someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure nothing, weather or curiosity, could get inside. There was no life buzzing within it, no comb visible at the entrance slit, nothing to suggest it had ever housed bees at all in recent memory, and yet someone had cared enough to seal it like a coffin. It took her 3 days to work up the nerve to open it, partly from exhaustion and partly from a feeling she could not name, a sense that whatever was inside had been left for a reason and that reasons in her experience were rarely simple. On the 4th evening, with the last light slanting gold through the cottonwoods, she pried the lid free with a flathead bar, the iron tacks shrieking as they gave way one by one, and what she found inside was not bees at all, but a hive whose interior had been carefully gutted and fitted with a false floor, beneath which lay a tin box, the kind men used for important papers, wrapped twice in oilcloth to keep out the damp. Her hands trembled opening it, not from fear exactly, but from the particular reverence a person feels when they understand, before they even see the contents, that they are about to learn something they were never meant to know. Inside the tin was a thick bundle of letters tied with wax string, a small leather ledger gone soft with age, and a single brass key tarnished black with no lock anywhere in sight to match it. The letters were written in a careful foreign-leaning hand, and the topmost one, dated 1871, began not with a greeting but with a confession, that the writer, Albrecht Vogel, had something on his conscience that he could not carry to his grave silently, and that he was placing this record where only a true beekeeper, someone patient and thorough enough to open every hive rather than simply burn the lot, would ever find it. What the letters revealed, over the following days as Odessa read them by lamplight with the same careful attention she once gave her father's bees, was a story 14 years buried. In 1871 the town of Amity Springs had been a different and more hopeful place, building toward a railroad spur that would have connected it to the larger line at Hutchinson, and the town had raised, through subscription and sacrifice, a considerable sum, nearly $3,000, a fortune for a town that size, to secure the surveying rights and the right-of-way contracts. That money had been entrusted to the town's most respected citizen, a banker named Josiah Renner, who was, by every account in the ledger, a man the whole county trusted without question. But Albrecht Vogel, who kept his bees on land adjoining Renner's own property and who had, by his own admission, a habit of walking at odd hours when sleep wouldn't come, had witnessed Renner himself burying a strong box behind his property line on a moonless night in October of that year, and had watched, 3 weeks later, as Renner stood before the assembled town and wept convincingly about thieves in the night and a ruined railroad dream, accepting the community's grief-stricken sympathy. Even as he quietly continued building his own fortune through loans made at suspiciously generous terms to desperate farmers in the years that followed. Vogel had never spoken of what he saw. He was an immigrant with broken English and no standing in town, a man who kept bees and kept to himself, and he understood, with the particular clarity of an outsider, that his word against Renner's would be worth nothing and might cost him everything. But it had eaten at him, the ledger made clear year after year as he watched the town shrink and struggle under the weight of a debt it believed was simply bad luck, while the man responsible grew steadily richer, lending money back to the very families he had robbed. The brass key, his letters explained, opened a strongbox he had dug up himself in secret one night out of some impulse he couldn't fully justify even to himself, not to take the money, which he never touched, but to move it somewhere only the truth could find it again, somewhere he trusted more than he trusted any bank or any court in a county run by men loyal to Renner's name. He had reburied it, he wrote, beneath the old surveyor's marker stone at the eastern edge of what was meant to have been the railroad right-of-way, and he had hidden the key and the proof inside the one hive he trusted no curious neighbor or careless nephew to ever bother opening, sealing it the way a man seals a confession he isn't brave enough to speak aloud but isn't willing to let die with him either. The final letter, dated only weeks before his disappearance, read simply that his conscience would not let him rest, and that he intended finally to go to the county seat and tell what he knew, and that if anything should happen to him before he could, he prayed whoever found this would finish what he could not. Odessa sat with that ledger open on her lap long after the lamp had burned low, and she understood, with a kind of grief that surprised her, that Albrecht Vogel had likely never made it to the county seat at all, that a quiet immigrant beekeeper threatening to expose the town's wealthiest man had simply vanished, and that no one had thought it strange enough to investigate, because no one had thought him important enough to miss. She did not act immediately because she had learned, from losing everything twice over, that haste was a luxury only the comfortable could afford. She spent the following weeks rebuilding her hives in the daylight, earning a small reputation around Amity Springs as the strange widow who'd bought the bee ruin and somehow gotten honey from it within a season, selling jars at Hiram's Mercantile that people bought first out of curiosity and then, once they tasted it, out of genuine appetite, because Odessa's honey, like her father's, carried a clover sweetness that the local wildflower honey never quite managed. And in the evenings she asked careful, harmless-seeming questions of Hiram and the older townsfolk about the railroad that never came, learning that Josiah Renner was still very much alive, now in his 70s, the president of the Amity Springs Trust Bank, a deacon at the Lutheran Church, a man whose portrait hung in the lobby beneath a small brass plaque honoring his decades of civic service, a man whose grandson, a sharp-tongued young cashier named Whit Renner, had recently taken to, publicly questioning why a friendless widow with no family standing had any business buying up land and selling honey as though she belonged in Amity Springs at all. It was Whit who first made trouble for her, small and petty at first, a delayed shipment of jars misplaced, at the Mercantile, a whispered rumor that her honey was cut with sugar water, a complaint lodged with the town council suggesting her unlicensed apiary posed a public nuisance and ought to be shut down, and Odessa understood quickly enough that the trouble wasn't really about bees at all, but about a Renner instinct, inherited like a family nose for sensing when someone quiet was getting too close to something dangerous. When she went, with appropriate caution, to inquire at the county recorder's office about the old 1871 railroad subscription records, the clerk informed her, with visible discomfort, that those particular ledgers had been lost in a fire some years back, an answer delivered in the practiced tone of a lie that had been told before. Josiah Renner himself, she learned, had personally donated the funds to rebuild the recorder's office after that very fire. She felt, for the first time since Walter's death, something other than grief or weariness, She felt the old steady anger her father used to get when a swarm was provoked unfairly, a slow, deliberate kind of anger that didn't shout but simply decided, quietly and permanently, what it was going to do about the matter. She wrote, in her own careful hand, a complete copy of Vogel's account, preserving his original letters untouched as proof, and she began, with the patience of a woman who'd spent a lifetime waiting on bees to do their slow, honest work, building a case that no one loyal to Renner could simply burn away in a recorder's office fire. She found the surveyor's marker stone exactly where Vogel's letters described, half sunk in prairie grass at the eastern edge of a field now owned, unsurprisingly, by the Renner Family Trust, and she dug at first light on a Sunday morning while the town was at church, with Hiram standing watch and an old shovel borrowed from his shed, until the iron edge of a strongbox rang dull against the blade. Inside, wrapped in tarred canvas gone brittle but intact, was the original subscription ledger bearing dozens of farmers' own signatures and contribution amounts, alongside a sealed deposit of railroad bonds that had never been cashed because Renner, fearing they could be traced, had simply buried them rather than risk converting them, choosing patience and silence over greed's usual hurry, never once imagining that someone else's patience would outlast his own. What followed was not a dramatic public unmasking in a courtroom, because Odessa understood, with the wisdom of a woman who had been disbelieved before, that quiet, documented truth traveled further than shouted accusation. She brought the ledger, the letters, and the recovered bonds not first to the town but to a circuit judge in Hutchinson with no particular loyalty to the Renner name, a careful, deliberate man named Judge Aldous Fenn who had, as it happened, spent 30 years growing suspicious of how the Amity Springs Trust Bank always seemed to prosper precisely when its neighbors struggled. He took several weeks comparing handwriting, verifying signatures against county marriage and land records, and confirming, through an aging clerk in Topeka who remembered the original railroad survey, that the right-of-way contracts described in Vogel's letters had indeed once existed and had indeed mysteriously lapsed the same autumn the subscription money disappeared. When the truth finally surfaced in Amity Springs, it surfaced the way honey rises through a strained cloth, slow and complete and impossible to push back down. Josiah Renner, confronted in his own bank lobby beneath his own civic plaque, did not weep or confess. He simply grew very still and very old all at once, the way men do when a lifetime's careful construction collapses in a single afternoon. The bonds, though decades past their face value usefulness for the original railroad, were liquidated under the judge's order and combined with the recovered subscription funds to form the foundation of a community trust, administered not by Renner's bank but by a new board the judge insisted include Odessa herself, on account of her having recovered it, and Hiram Tolliver, on account of his being the only man in town with no debts owed to either family. The town did not immediately know what to do with its own restored fortune, having spent 14 years believing it simply had bad luck instead of a thief, and there was no shortage of voices, Whit Renner's loudest among them, who tried to suggest the money rightfully belonged to the bank that had managed it all along. An argument Judge Fenn dismantled with a single dry sentence noting that managing stolen property does not constitute ownership of it. What Odessa proposed instead, once the dust of accusation and disbelief had settled, was not a railroad. The spur line was decades obsolete by then, the larger rail networks having long since made the original dream unnecessary, but something she understood better than tracks and ties. A cooperative apiary and honey works on the very land Albrecht Vogel had once tended, open to any family in Amity Springs willing to learn the trade, with profits shared according to labor rather than land. Already owned, so that even the poorest widow or youngest orphaned son could build something steady with their hands the way her father had taught her to. She insisted too on a modest stone marker placed at the eastern edge of the old right-of-way, engraved simply with Albrecht Vogel's name and the words he never got to speak himself, a debt repaid though the man could not be brought back to receive it. Josiah Renner faced no prison sentence, the statute of limitations and his advanced age conspiring to spare him that particular reckoning, but he lost his bank, his deaconship, his civic plaque quietly removed and never replaced, and he spent his remaining years a diminished, avoided figure in a town that had once trusted him completely, which Odessa came to understand was its own kind of justice, the slow public unmaking of a reputation built on theft, no less real for being unaccompanied by iron bars. Whit Renner, stripped of the easy advantage his grandfather's name had always afforded him, eventually left Amity Springs altogether, and no one much mourned the departure. And so it was that Odessa Calloway, 61 years old, cast out by a man who told her to be grateful, who bought 40 broken hives for $4 because no one else wanted them and she had nothing left to lose by wanting them too, became the woman who restored to an entire town what it had spent 14 years believing was simply gone forever, all because she was the kind of person who, faced with something sealed and abandoned, chose curiosity and patience over the easier comfort of walking past it. She never once used the discovery to enrich herself beyond a small fair share she insisted on dividing among the cooperative same as anyone else's labor earned, because her father had taught her, all those years ago lifting a frame heavy with comb, that bees never wasted what they built, and neither should a person, and that the sweetness left over after a community took care of itself first was the only kind worth keeping. She lived another 19 years on Bell Creek Road, tending hives that multiplied into the hundreds, teaching dozens of Amity Springs children the patient language her father had taught her, and when she finally passed in 1905, the whole town turned out, not out of obligation, but because by then everyone understood exactly what she had given them, and exactly what it had cost her to give it. We began by telling you that a 61-year-old widow, cast out with almost nothing, bought a ruined apiary for $4 because it was cheap and forgotten and nobody else wanted it, and we promised you that something sealed inside would change her life and restore an entire community, and now you know it was not gold or jewels but the truth itself, 14 years buried, waiting inside a hive too stubborn to rot. Odessa Calloway never set out to be anyone's reckoning. She set out only to keep bees the way her father taught her, with patience, with respect for what others overlooked, and with the quiet certainty that nothing built carefully is ever truly wasted, even when the world insists on calling it worthless. It was that same unhurried attention, the willingness to open the one box everyone else would have left sealed, that uncovered what an entire town had been too tired or too afraid to ask about for 14 long years, and it was her refusal to use what she found for herself alone that turned a personal restoration into a collective one. Thank you for spending this hour with Odessa and with us. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs reminding that what looks abandoned isn't always empty, and that the people written off the fastest are often the ones quietly building something the rest of the world hasn't noticed yet. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.